Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm here with a new video breaking down yet another faction in the Last Alliance Total War, today's faction being the Empire of Numenor. If you're new here, the Last Alliance Total War is a mod for Total War Shogun 2, set in the Second Age of Middle-earth, being somewhat of a prequel timeline-wise to Total War Rise of Mordor, a mod for Total War Attila set in the Third Age instead. As of making this video, the mod is currently in development, being in the version 0.2.7 alpha. Although that's somewhat early in the mod's development cycle, there's still a fair bit of content in the mod, with several factions and a small campaign being ready to play. For those of you interested in the mod, I'm going to leave it linked in the description, and I do encourage you to play. Today's video, as I said, will be a faction breakdown, with me going over the history within both the books and films of Tolkien's universe of the Empire of Numenor, before looking at the civilizations that inspired it in real life. After that, I'm going to look at the faction's units and break them down, covering their battlefield roles as well as looking at their equipment and seeing how historically authentic it is. Now that you know what mod we're looking at and what the video itself is going to cover, let's start by going over the general overview of today's faction, the Empire of Numenor. Numenor is an island nation that was considered the greatest kingdom of men to ever exist, as well as potentially being the greatest kingdom of any race in Middle-earth, being founded at the end of the First Age by the Valar, the island being situated between the western shores of Middle-earth and the eastern beaches of the Undying Lands. The men of Numenor, the Numenoreans, were descendants of the Edain, the men of the First Age who fought alongside the elves in the wars against the first Dark Lord Morgoth, their service to the light being repaid by their new island home, from which they would emerge a mighty civilization, the first king of these men being Elros, the brother of Elrond, who chose to become a human rather than as an elf. As an additional gift to their race, the Numenoreans were given long life and immense health, leading them to live hundreds of years and becoming renowned for being incredibly tall and strong, traits that would serve them well. From their new island, the Numenoreans would become seafarers, visiting the shores of Middle-earth, building strong bonds with the elves and the native men of Middle-earth at first, teaching these lesser beings societal advancements, such as farming and metalwork, leading to the Numenoreans being highly thought of, although this would change as time went on, and the Numenoreans began to harvest the natural resources of the coasts, leading to conflict with the natives and the eventual establishment of colonies along the coast, setting the foundation for the future empire. Firm allies of the elves, the Numenoreans would fight against the forces of Sauron in the Second Age, denying him victory and beating him back repeatedly, although the defiance would lead Sauron into targeting them. Shadow, however, would fall on Numenor, as its people gradually turned against the elves and the Valar due to the jealousy of the immortality of the elves, something that the men of Numenor desired more and more, leading them to turn their back on the light of the Valar, the divine beings who had given them the gift of long life. Eventually, the population of Numenor split into two, the faithful, who still supported the elves and the Valar, and the kingsmen, who were becoming ever darker, enslaving the peoples of southern Middle-earth and establishing great settlements such as the port city of Umbar, these people's actions helping to turn the Haradrim against the Numenoreans and pushing them into the arms of Sauron, coming to found an empire of sorts, this faction being based on the emerging Numenorean Empire rather than the traditional kingdom of Numenor. Eventually, the throne would fall to the last king of Numenor, Ar-Pharazon the Golden, who usurped the throne from its rightful heir, his cousin. Viewing Sauron as a rival, Ar-Pharazon would invade Middle-earth with an army so mighty that Sauron's allies deserted him immediately, the Dark Lord being captured by the forces of the king and being sent back to Numenor as a prisoner, although the Dark Lord would use this to his advantage, playing on the dark hearts of the Numenoreans, eventually becoming the chief advisor of the king and converting Numenor to the worship of the Dark Lord Morgoth. Finally, Sauron would take the final steps in destroying Numenor, convincing Ar-Pharazon to invade the Undying Lands so as to secure immortality, the invasion being destroyed by the Valar and Numenor itself sinking under the waves as punishment for its blasphemy. While Numenor itself may have been destroyed as well as the physical form of Sauron, who could no longer take on fair forms, the Numenorean race lived on, both in the form of the Numenorean colonies of the Empire in southern Middle-earth, which would quickly fall under the sway of Sauron, the inhabitants coming to be known as the Black Numenoreans, and a group of the faithful who would sail to northern Middle-earth and gather the Numenoreans and native peoples living there to establish the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, both these kingdoms being baptized in war when Sauron launched his invasion of Gondor, kicking off the War of the Last Alliance in which the faithful descendants of Numenor would prove successful, defeating Sauron and mitigating his threat for centuries. The Black Numenoreans, the spiritual inheritors of the Empire of Numenor, compared to the initial kingdom, would die in droves in the war, and much of their blood would be lost during the Third Age, though the blood of Numenor would continue into the Third Age, the most prominent Numenoreans being seen in the Lord of the Rings books and films being Aragorn, as well as Denethor and his sons Boromir and Faramir, the nobility of Gondor over 3,000 years after the destruction of Numenor, still being of Numenorean heritage and still proving to be a thorn in Sauron's side, as seen in the War of the Ring. Numenor itself is only really shown in the prologue and flashback scenes in the Fellowship of the Ring, where we see Numenorean troops of Gondor and Arnor fighting alongside the elves during the War of the Last Alliance, the most notable Numenorean shown being the King of Arnor, Elendil, and his son the King of Gondor, Isildur, the man who would strike the One Ring from Sauron's finger, but who would not destroy it, allowing Sauron to survive and return millennia later, these men being successors to the Kingdom of Numenor rather than its empire, so you could say that the Empire of Numenor never really appeared in the films, although with the new Amazon show being released later on this year, it's almost certain we're going to see more of both the Kingdom and Empire of Numenor. In terms of historical cultures who may have inspired the faction, I find Numenor to be a fusion of the mythical city of Atlantis and the United States of America, the Atlantis connection being quite clear as Numenor is a technologically advanced civilization found in the western oceans off the coast of the mainland, a civilization which would eventually be swallowed by the ocean as punishment for their arrogance. The few survivors of the catastrophe found in colonies, such as allegedly Egypt according to Plato, Tolkien openly stating his inspiration was Atlantis. The United States comparison for me is more so because of the role that Numenor often played in conflicts in Middle-earth, arriving in the middle of wars waged by the elves against expansionist powers to the east, such as the forces of Sauron, helping to turn the tide in those conflicts, much as how during the First and Second World Wars, the United States would join the wars midway, offering massive amounts of aid to their allies as well as dispatching large armies to fight in Europe. The inhabitants of Numenor, much like the United States, originating from Middle-earth/Europe before sailing to their new home. Another similarity would be the military installations dotted around Europe, much like the initial Numenorean colonies established so as to make supporting the elves in their conflicts against Sauron easier. With the history of the faction looked at both in and out of universe, let's move on to the units themselves. Unlike Rise of Mordor, in which generals can sometimes be more elite units that can be used multiple times in one army, the generals in this mod are unique, with each faction generally only having 2 generals, the Empire of Numenor being no exception. The first option for general for the Empire of Numenor is the Numenorean bodyguard, a unit of elite swordmen who most likely act as the bodyguard for the royal family or high nobility. Looking at the men, they're extremely heavily armoured, each man having a helmet that resembles a medieval barbute or the classical Corinthian helmets which inspired barbutes, these helmets having a raised point similar to the acorn helmets used by Ottoman Sipahi. Attached to the sides of the helmets are metal pieces shaped to resemble gull wings, a classical symbol of the seafaring Numenoreans, the helmets having etched brows as well as a gilded nasal guard. Wings attached to the helmets is something that is known from the historical record, though they tended to be far more ceremonial armour than equipment designed to see battle, though the tops of these wings seem as if they could catch downward strikes from enemy blades. Wing symbolism also being seen used by Gondorian troops in the Third Age, the gilded part of the helmet reflecting the widespread gilding of armour by wealthier warriors who wish to show off their wealth. Turning to the men's body armour, each man wears a mail hauberk and pants over which they wear plate components. Protecting the upper torso over the mail hauberk, they have a plate cuirass and gorget, the gorget appearing to be over the cuirass rather than under it, an inaccuracy for sure. The cuirass is gilded with symbols of wings and stars, both in gold and silver, showing off the importance and wealth of these troops, even if the design of the gilded portions vary between men. Over the top of their mail pants, the men have the rider's split of their hauberk, something which is wrong for multiple reasons. Infantry for starters didn't require rider's splits, given they weren't on horseback, although it is possible that these men did ride horses at times. What's not historically plausible is wearing mail over which you have plate, as these men have plate folds over their mail, such excessive armour not being used by troops due to the sheer weight of having 3 layers of armour. Protecting their upper arms, each man wears a set of spolders, some gilded and others not, while they wear plate van braces to protect their forearms. The short sleeves of their mail hauberks leaving gaps, which could be protected if the sleeves were longer. Finally, to defend their lower legs, the men wear greaves in combination with sabatons, the armour of the unit generally looking to be inspired by the plate harnesses of the 15th and 16th century men-at-arms and knights, the look being finished off by a blue cloak over their backs. For shields, every man has a shield which looks like a cross between a pavis and a kite shield, being large enough to almost fully protect the user, seemingly being capable of being used as a mobile fortification if shoved into the ground hard enough. Metal rims on kite shields were used as well as on pavis shields, so the rims get a pass from me, the shields being painted either blue or red, blue being a traditional Numenorean colour, while the red may indicate the growing darkness of Numenor at the time. Each shield has a metal symbol on it of either the crown of Numenor or the Numenorean star, this metal decoration helping to strengthen the shield somewhat akin to a metal boss. As cool as the shields are, they're entirely superfluous in the hands of these men given that they're so heavily armoured. Once plate armour began to cover men head to toe, shields were discarded as the armour being worn provided enough protection, with even before the advent of plate armour, shields being downsized as armour became better, shields going from large kite shields to smaller heater shields. So even if these men were to use a shield, a far smaller one would make sense, given that PvP shields especially were used by lightly armoured troops such as crossbowmen rather than heavy infantry. For weapons, each man uses an arming sword with an upswept crossguard and a round pommel, the sword reminding me of arming swords from the 11th and 12th centuries. This weapon too, like their shield, doesn't make a lot of sense, given that when you're as heavily armoured as these troops are, a two-handed weapon like a poleaxe is your best choice. The ability to have two hands free to wield a weapon due to dropping a shield, allowing warriors to use far more devastating weapons that were highly effective against armoured enemies, these swords being at a massive disadvantage when fighting against foes also highly protected by plate armour. Moving on to the unit officer, he's equipped similarly to his men, but there are some key differences that help set him apart as their superior. For starters, his cuirass, spaulders, vambraces, greaves and folds are all gilded, unlike his troops who aren't uniformly gilded, as well as the white cloak he wears all help to set him apart. The biggest difference, however, is his helmet, which retains the same acorn barbute shape, but is more gilded, having an additional plate over the brow which resembles attachments seen on Arabic helmets during the Crusades. The main difference between his helmet and his men's is the crest of feathers on both sides, most likely being seagull feathers, and the look that most Numenorean troops attempt to copy with their metal helmet wings. Feather attachments like this help to make the officer highly visible to his troops, with feathers being used like this historically quite often, such as by ancient Greek troops as well as medieval knights, serving to distinguish warriors on the battlefield. Turning to his equipment, the officer uses the same sword as his men and has a shield that's only differentiated by its gold and black paint job, helping to show off his elevated status. With the officer and his men covered, let's look at the unit's role. A pretty standard general unit, the Numenorean bodyguard are a good choice if trying to build an army with a heavy-hitting and tough leader, the unit being very good at enduring damage and dealing it back out to enemies. Funnily enough, this is the more defensive of the two general options that the Numenorean Empire has, so if a hardier general is what you want, I recommend these guys even if they aren't that special compared to some of the other generals seen in other factions. A cool unit for sure, however the next general unit blows them out of the water when it comes to how unique they are. That unit being Ar-Pharazon himself leading the Golden Guard, an elite unit of pikemen which I believe is the only pike general unit in the mod. Living up to their name, each man in this unit is kitted out with golden armour, the actual aesthetic of these warriors resembling artwork I've seen of Numenorean troops online, especially with their helmets, which are pretty much burgonets of the Renaissance, their gilded helmets being decorated with emblems of wings on their cheek guards, some troops having additional metal attachments in the shape of wings facing to the rear of their helmet, similar to depictions of the Greek god Hermes' winged helmet. For body armour, these men wear a combination of a mail hauberk, over which they wear a gilded scale hauberk with a rider split, over which they wear a gilded breastplate decorated with the symbol of Numenor. Much like the previous unit, this is a massive amount of armour to be wearing, which would be incredibly cumbersome to bear, such a combination of armour not being seen in history to my knowledge, or at least not to this level. Each man wears spaulders and rear braces for upper arm protection, while their forearms are protected by overlapping plate vambraces over the top of mail gloves, the lower legs covered in golden greaves and sabatons. Overall, these men's armour looks like a mix of Renaissance and Roman era equipment, which makes sense given the Renaissance was inspired by the classical era to a massive degree. For shields, the men use a shield that resembles the ancient Greek Aspis shield, except that this shield is clipped, making it look like the Aspis in size, but more closely resemble the crescent-shaped pelter used by peltists of the classical period. The shield is rimmed by metal and looks to be wood covered in black lacquer, with the symbol of Numenor made of metal on the centre of the shield. Pikemen did use shields such as the Macedonian Phalangites, who used the Telamon shield, which was smaller than the Aspis used by hoplites, so it makes sense that these men would use shields, even if pikemen of the early modern period ditched them. For weapons, each man has an arming sword at their side similar to those used by the previous unit, but their main weapon is a pike. Unfortunately, the design of these pikes are flawed as all of them have a long blade-shaped tip, and some even have cross pieces on them designed to stop bodies from sliding down the shaft. However, these are more intended to stop animals that have been speared in hunting from killing the hunter, such a feature being common on boar spears. For a pike, it makes no sense, given that the less weight you have on the end of your shaft, the better, as if the tip of the pike is too heavy, it becomes almost impossible to wield and can break the wooden shaft, which is why pike tips were as small as possible. This flaw also being seen on the pikes used by the Uruk-hai in the Two Towers film, although I guess you could explain it away by saying that given that the Numenoreans are a race renowned for their strength, they could wield such heavy pikes, even if the wood itself would be struggling immensely. Given pike blocks were an advancement in military tactics and technology during the Renaissance and early modern period, it makes sense that the most advanced kingdom of men would utilize such an army, or at least their most elite units would operate in such an advanced way. Looking at the unit officer, it's Ar-Pharazon himself who lives up to his reputation as the Golden by wearing a golden harness. Wearing much the same armour as his men, he is distinguished by an articulated plate cuirass, as well as folds over the male hauberk and pants that I spoke about earlier, with a golden cloak covering his back, the only other distinguishing feature being his helmet. Instead of the burgonets worn by his men, Ar-Pharazon wears a bassinet with a beautiful faceplate. The breathing holes shaped like stars, which is a nice touch, although the holes seem a bit too large, the helmet looking like those utilised during the late 14th and 15th centuries. Attached atop the helmet is ornamentation that I believe is meant to signify the crown of Numenor, which makes sense given he is the king, while the very peak of the helmet is crowned by large feathers, these also being seen in historical depictions of medieval knights, so they get the stamp of approval on the historical accuracy side of things. The king lacks a shield and instead wields a longsword that looks straight out of the 14th and 15th centuries. While such a weapon isn't necessarily the most effective weapon he could use, it's far better than an arming sword, with some real kings such as Henry V of England known to have used a longsword even when more effective weapons such as poleaxes were available, so I won't say that it's inaccurate that he uses a longsword, just that there's better options available. Moving on to the unit role, these guys are pikemen and as such are absolutely devastating against cavalry in particular, but can grind through just about any unit as long as they're fighting them head on and retain cohesion. If cohesion is lost or the unit is flanked, there is a severe disadvantage, with archers and other ranged units being their bane, due to the lack of large shields similar to the other heavy infantry the faction can field. What this means is that the Golden Guard are a general unit that's a glass cannon, dealing out significant damage but being highly vulnerable to most other units, being flanked by cavalry being a death sentence. It's for that fragility that I actually recommend picking the Numenorean bodyguard over this unit, as while it's the more unique unit, it's not that very well rounded, which is by design, meaning you have to be very selective in how you choose to use it. A great unit for sure, but one that I think can only really serve in a limited role compared to its competitor. Moving on from the highest of the Numenoreans, we come to their lowest, with the volunteer spearmen. This rabble of militia is almost completely unarmoured, some few wearing quilted vests over their regular clothing, while a handful have rounded helmets with cheek guards and a nasal helm, similar to basic Corinthian helmets, most of the men wearing either fur caps or Phrygian hats. Overall, the lack of armour makes sense, and the fact that the one armour piece that they do have is helmets makes even more sense, given that the most important bit of armour you'd prioritise acquiring would be a helmet. For shields, the men use kite shields that look straight out of the 11th century, rimmed with metal and strengthened with a metal boss, such a shield being very useful for protecting unarmoured troops like these. For weapons, they use a variety of spears, scythes, and bardishas, the scythes in particular being reminiscent of Japanese naginata, while the spears and bardishas wouldn't look out of place in a museum collection. As the unit lacks an officer, we'll jump into their role. Essentially, these guys are the equivalent of the orc rabble units, being vulnerable to just about everything including cavalry, the one thing that spearmen are meant to be able to counter. In the early game and for very cheap armies, they'll be a building block of your forces but should be replaced as quickly as possible given how incredibly bad they are, the only thing in their favour being that they can form up a spear war, allowing them to hold the line against the other rabble units that they'll be expected to face. Overall, a poor unit, but one that's necessary to field, even if only for a small period of time, the unit not even really being useful as a second tier support unit in spite of its cheapness. Moving on from the volunteer spearmen, we come to a fairly unique unit in the mod, the Numenorean pikemen. Not even a direct evolution of the previous unit, but more an alternative army building choice, these troops are the sole pike unit the faction can field with the exception of the Golden Guard. Looking at their accoutrement, these warriors wear the standard Numenorean helmet, which is essentially the helmet used rarely by the volunteer spearmen, but with a more decorated cheek guard and gilded nasal bar, metal attached to the sides of the helmet in the shape of very basic wings. Such attachments could catch enemy blows, although to my knowledge, such adornment wasn't seen on historical armour. Turning to the rest of their bodies, they wear a mail hauberk over which they wear a plate gorget to protect the neck. The hauberk's covered with a variety of red, blue, brown and black surcoats emblazoned with the symbols of Numenor, such as the crown of Numenor as well as stars, seagull wings and anchors, all reflecting their seafaring heritage. In addition, they wear vambraces and greaves, some having mail gloves and others using leather instead. Overall, their armour reminds me of equipment worn by troops during the transitional period between mail and plate during the 13th and 14th centuries, when warriors began to steadily add plate in combination with their mail. Lacking shields as many pikemen did, for weapons these troops have arming swords at their side, while their main weapons are a variety of pikes, most of them being the same as those used by the Golden Guard, although a couple resemble spears just sized up. The same critiques for the Golden Guard's pikes applying to these warriors' weapons. Turning to the unit officer, he is equipped much the same as his troops, except he has a blue cloak as well as a plate cuirass engraved with the wings and anchor of Numenor, using an arming sword as his weapon in combination with steel-rimmed and embossed bucklers. Such a shield being good in combination with his armour, though the buckler would also work perfectly with the pikemen too. Its small size yet ability to provide extra protection being quite useful. As a unit, these guys can be the core of a Numenorean army, massed pikemen being quite the strategy on the open battlefield, though I will say that the unit shares the same weaknesses and strengths of the Golden Guard. It's amplified in terms of weaknesses and limited in terms of strengths, given that they're a regular unit and not a general unit. Personally, I'd recommend using these guys as the centre of your line or as a strategic reserve to be deployed when enemy ranged units and cavalry can't pose a threat to them, using their pikes to carve through enemy infantry. Ultimately a pretty good unit and one that allows Numenor to potentially play quite uniquely at a fairly cheap price, all things considered. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Numenorean spearmen, the next step in the spear line after the volunteer spearmen. Equipped identically to the pikemen, these warriors look much like the early troops of Gondor seen fighting in the War of the Last Alliance. However, instead of discarding shields like the pikes, they use the same shield as the Numenorean bodyguard, which suits these men well given that their lesser level of armour and role as the heavy infantry line of Numenor's armies. Their weapons being arming swords as a backup, but spears as their main weapon. The spears being a mix of winged spears, spears with small diamond cross pieces, and irregular spears. Skipping the officer who's identical to the previous officer, except that he uses his men's shield as well as a spear, these troops will make up the bulk of your army from the early game to the mid game, unless you choose to make a pike-oriented army instead. Recruit as many of these guys as possible to replace the volunteer spearmen, as these troops are a clear step up from them, easily holding the line against hordes of low-tier enemies and being a threat to cavalry. A solid unit both on the open battlefield and in sieges, the Numenorean spearmen are good even after they're superseded by better units, being good in a support role. Moving on from the Numenorean spearmen, we come to their advanced form, the Numenorean armoured spearmen, who are equipped identically when it comes to shields, arms and armour, except that they have plate cuirasses over the mail hauberks. Every man in the unit essentially being equipped the same as the lower unit's officers. This unit's officer only being distinguished by his folds over his upper legs. As a unit, these troops will be the core of your professional infantry from the mid-game to the late game, being not quite an even match for professional elven infantry, but still being good nonetheless, being hardier than the previous unit due to their additional armour, being more resilient to ranged attacks and still capable of fighting off horsemen. Able to hold out against just about any unit, there's only one spear unit that outshines it, and that's the Numenorean heavy infantry. Each man is equipped identically to the officer leading the Numenorean bodyguard general unit, except for their spears, all having the ornate helmet with feathers attached, making these warriors resemble an ancient form of the Citadel Guard, an elite spear unit much like this one that can be seen in the Rise of Mordor mod. Skipping their cloaked men and their cloaked officer, who's quite literally the Numenorean bodyguard officer down to his golden black shield. These guys are truly an equal match for the highest quality elves, showing off just how advanced the mighty Numenor truly is. When formed up in a spear war, almost every enemy will break against them, revealing how tough they are. However, much like a lot of the other unique units, I say that they're better in moderation rather than as the core of your army, as the armoured spearmen will be able to deal with most issues that you'll face, these troops being better as an ace up your sleeve or a reserve rather than as your main force, given how expensive they are. A great unit overall that I recommend using, even if only sparingly to strengthen your forces. With the Numenorean heavy infantry covered, all of the Empire of Numenor spear line have been looked at, so we'll move on to their melee infantry beginning with their first axe unit, the Numenorean militia. Much like their name suggests, these troops are a militia force and are outfitted as such, each man having the standard Numenorean helmet, while for body armour they wear a gambeson, a form of padded armour that saw widespread use among lesser troops who are unable to afford expensive plate or mail armour during the Middle Ages, even this armour being pretty good at protecting you from sword slashes. For shields, each man has a buckler, some being rimmed and others not, all having a metal boss however, the shields looking like those used in the British Isles during the 13th and 14th centuries. For a weapon, they use a one-handed axe that wouldn't look out of place in the hands of troops from all across the Middle Ages, even if the axe shaft itself is a bit long. Axes being used by the militia makes more sense than swords, given that axes were a far more common weapon, especially in the hands of lower class troops, so these troops using them is something I fully support. Turning to their officer, he's a standard Numenorean officer except that he uses a buckler in combination with his arming sword. As a unit, these troops will be an early core of your army, being useful as a striking arm of your forces while your volunteer spearmen hold the line in combination with them. Realistically, the only units they can be expected to beat are opposing rabble, but due to the offensive nature of the axes in the mod, they do fairly well in that role, but there are other units that better fit the role of early semi-shock infantry, and one of those units is the Numenorean adventurers. Representing the first Numenorean adventurers to broaden their horizons in Middle-earth, these troops are unarmoured, wearing only the hardy clothes that they use while exploring, wearing hoods rather than helmets and having leather cloaks and vests. One thing to note is that I'm pretty sure this unit is made up of both men and women, which makes sense given that the explorers who first made it to Middle-earth and established colonies would have been a mix of men and women, so it's nice to see. Lacking a shield, these warriors instead wield two-handed axes, reminiscent of both Dane axes, the large size of the weapon allowing them to double as walking sticks for travellers in addition to being capable of hacking people and horses in two. As the unit lacks an officer, we'll jump into their role, that being pure shock infantry. On the battlefield, these troops are among the most lethal infantry that the Empire of Numenor can field, tearing through enemy units, even those that far outrank it, especially when hitting them from the rear. For such an early game unit, the Numenorean adventurers have a long life of useful service, being capable of being put to use even in higher tier armies. Overall, a really powerful unit that for its cheap price and availability really stands out in the faction roster. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Numenorean Marines, who much like the Venturers represent another side of Numenor. In this case, it's naval strength. Looking at these troops, there were a variety of helmets, some resembling nasal helms with cheek guards, but with the customary Numenorean flair, while others look much like burgonets but without the typical central ridge. For body armour, they solely wear a metal cuirass with gilded accents and vambraces, lacking any other armour. While historically Marines tended to be as lightly armoured as possible, given that falling overboard wearing armour was a death sentence, when unarmoured Marines fought armoured foes at sea who chose to wear armour despite its drawbacks in naval combat, the armoured troops tended to come out on top, such as the Battle of Salamis, when small numbers of heavily armoured hoplites proved too much for the lightly equipped Persian Marines to beat. In that case, it makes sense that the Numenoreans would prioritise battlefield capabilities rather than survival at sea. Turning to their equipment, they use axes and bucklers identical to those used by the Numenorean militia, except that these ones have more naval livery, which makes sense given that they're naval troops. Another weapon that these warriors have, however, is javelins, given that they also double as skirmishers, throwing javelins at opposing ships before boarding them, the same strategy being useful on the open battlefield where they compel enemy units before closing in on them. While I generally view skirmishers as being outclassed troops, because they are melee infantry with added skirmish abilities, I see it as a feature for these guys that enhances their prowess, making them that much more useful. When it comes to melee, these guys are a contender for being the core of your army in mid-tier builds, given that they're roughly equivalent to the standard Numenorean swordsmen, being more offensive oriented with the additional strength of being able to skirmish, unlike the Numenorean swordsmen who are slightly more defensive oriented. As such, I say it's up to you what you choose to prioritise in an army build. However, even if you choose to base your army off of regular infantry rather than marines, these troops are still a good addition to have in your army, being really useful in sieges both on the offensive and defensive as a way of expanding your ranged attack power. A great unit overall. Let's move on to the next troops that the Empire of Numenor can field, the Numenorean shock infantry. Equipped identically to the Numenorean spearmen, these troops lack shields and instead uniformly wield longswords, these warriors looking like early 14th century knights and men-at-arms for the most part. Skipping their officer, who's a standard officer with no shield and a longsword, these guys are your standard military shock infantry. Funnily enough, they aren't a major step up from the Numenorean adventurers, sharing roughly equal stats while being more expensive, meaning that funnily enough, I'd have to say sticking with the militia unit is quite a valid option, with you having the ability to choose who you want to use. Personally, if money is a concern, when army building I'd say recruit the Venturers, but if you can afford to fork out slightly extra, the Numenorean shock infantry aren't a bad choice. Coming in after the shock infantry, we have the aforementioned Numenorean swordsmen, who are the standard line swordsman unit of the faction, essentially being Numenorean spearmen but with arming swords instead of spears. Skipping their standard officer, these troops are a core part of your mid-game army if you choose them instead of marines, holding the line against enemy infantry and grinding them down in melee, being generally an all-around useful unit, even if they aren't as effective on the offensive and especially in sieges as the faction shock infantry who specialise in such a role. A good unit nonetheless, the Numenorean swordsmen complement the other standard Numenorean units well, fulfilling a nice sweet spot in army builds. Moving on from them, we come to their advanced version, the Numenorean armoured swordsmen, who are the sword counterpart to the Numenorean armoured spearmen, using the exact same equipment apart from swords of course, the officer too being the same as that faction's officer. Much of what I said for the previous unit counts here, these troops being a bulwark of your army but on a higher level, not quite being the equal of the best elven troops, but being more than a match for most other factions' mid-tier units, carving through them fairly well. As a unit, I recommend making these troops the core of your late game armies, as well as in multiplayer games if you can afford to amass them. Overall, a pretty strong unit that visually helps gap the change from the practically Numenorean armies fielded by Gondor in the War of the Last Alliance, to the soldiers of Gondor seen fighting in the War of the Ring with their full plate harnesses. Moving on, we come to the peak of the Empire of Numenor sword infantry, the Numenorean swordmasters, practically identical to the heavy infantry, except for their lack of shields and spears and decision to wield longswords. These troops are differentiated by their helmets, wearing a mix of ornate barbutes that look straight out of the late Third Age Gondorian army, with their metal wing attachments, while others wear helmets that resemble Corinthian helmets with the cheek guards, stylized to look like bird wings, skipping their officer who has the aforementioned helmet, combined with the body armour of the Numenorean heavy infantry officer. These troops are the most devastating shock infantry that the faction can field, having great armour capable of shrugging off enemy attacks while they tear through units, being capable of changing the course of battle with the swings of their swords. Expensive as you'd expect, these are the perfect unit to use in elite armies, both on the open battlefield as well as in sieges when on the offensive, although it is important to note that while amassing them may be difficult due to their price, there's not a unit that needs to be used en masse to be highly effective. A great unit, the only other unit fielded by the faction that can somewhat rival it when it comes to melee, are the Numenorean faithful of the Golden King. Equipped identically to the Golden Guard, except that their armour is silver instead of gold, these troops utilise the same crescent-shaped shields in combination with axes with ornate heads, looking far more weapon-like than the regular axes and tomahawks used by the other axemen, which could double as tools rather than pure weapons. Skipping on the officer who's identical to his troops, these warriors are among the best infantry the faction can field, being better on the defensive than the swordmasters, but not possessing as much offensive power as that unit. While they're most definitely strengthened than any army that has them, I say they're a win more unit that gives you extra hitting power, but isn't as crucial in army builds as the swordmasters are at an elite level. A cool unit nonetheless, the Numenorean faithful of the Golden King find themselves lacking a stable position within the roster. With these troops looked at, all of the faction's melee infantry, be they spearmen or swordsmen, or even shock infantry, have been covered, so we'll move on to their ranged units, beginning with the Hunters. As their name suggests, these are just ordinary woodsmen and hunters of the forests, wearing no armour with the exception of padded or leather jerkins. Much like the Numenorean adventurers, this unit is comprised of both men and women, which is a nice touch, all in the unit wearing green clothing to help camouflage them. For weapons, they have a hatchet at their side which also doubles as an everyday tool, while their main weapons are longbows, such weapons being very dangerous in the hands of those raised to wield them since birth, something I have a feeling these individuals have, as a lack an officer will jump into their role, that being your beginning archers. While not the best bowmen and women in the world, the troops do have stealth abilities, which means they can ambush and harass enemy forces, which is a useful ability to have. Added to that is the fact that as archers they by default have the ranged advantage over the skirmishers other factions can field, making them quite deadly when used in combination with other starting units the faction has access to. However, like all ranged units, the hunters have weaknesses, being doomed if engaged in melee and automatically dying if they're attacked by cavalry who are their main threat. A good starting unit, I would recommend replacing them with more professional bowmen, a good choice being the Numenorean archers. The ranged equivalent to the other standard Numenorean units, these troops have an arming sword at their side in case of melee and use the longbow as their main weapon. Skipping the standard bow-wielding officer, they have better stats than the hunters in every category, although they do lack the stealth ability of the previous unit, but make up for it everywhere else. While not quite the best idea to throw these guys into melee, they can survive it better than the hunters and can fight off rabble, although the real use of these guys is to slaughter attacking hordes of infantry at range, something they do fairly well. A very good unit to use in combination with the other standard Numenorean units, they'll make up the core of your army for a good chunk of the game, even if they are outshone by elven archers. Looking at the Numenorean city guard, these are the bow equivalent of the Numenorean swordmasters when it comes to armour, although they wear more basic helmets and lack spolders. In addition to their longbows, these men use bucklers, English longbowmen known to have used these as part of their equipment historically. However, given that English longbowmen tended to be lightly armoured, they needed those bucklers far more than these troops, who were armoured like their knights of the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Skipping their officer, who's marked out by his gilded pauldrons and spaulders, these men are a marked step up from the Numenorean archers, being more effective as troops both in ranged combat and in melee. You'd expect then for me to suggest recruiting them, but honestly I don't see the need for it. While they are better, there's an archer unit coming up that's far better to the point this unit is outclassed significantly. In such a situation, it doesn't make sense to spend money replacing your archer forces just to rapidly replace them with a far better option quickly right afterwards. I say these units are best used to strengthen your existing archers in limited numbers before other bow units become available to you. However, if you choose to make them the core of your ranged striking power, they'll definitely fulfill that role well enough. Ultimately, I see them as a transitional unit that is definitely good, but doesn't have a clear-cut niche that it's required for. Moving on, we come to the Numenorean Rangers, a stealth unit made to harass enemy forces that definitely has a clear-cut niche in the faction's roster. Looking at their equipment, these warriors are unarmoured with the possible exception of bracers that have been painted to be stealthy, the unit wearing hoods, veils and cloaks in forest colours. At their side, each man has an arming sword, or they use the longbow as their weapon of choice. Skipping their officer, who seems to not exist, these warriors take the role of the hunters and take it to the extreme, being the ultimate stealth unit raining down death on the enemy when they least expect it. While they aren't quite as good in melee as the previous unit and are still vulnerable to cavalry, I recommend incorporating them into your army in limited numbers to harass enemies, the unit being great at dealing out damage but not good at taking it, which limits their usefulness as the core of your ranged forces and makes them more suited for use as an extra option in your arsenal. Moving on to the faction's final ranged infantry unit, we have the epitome of Numenor's ranged strength, the Numenorean steel bowmen. Equipped identically to the Numenorean swordmasters, to the point that these guys even use longswords as their melee weapons, these troops are distinguished by their unique weapon, the Numenorean steel bow. This is a Numenorean invention that betrays just how advanced the Numenoreans are, the bow being hollow and made of metal, capable of matching even the best made elven bows, this technology being among the greatest feats of the Numenoreans, massively assisting them in their wars due to the sheer range and power of the weapon, although knowledge of the technology would be lost during the Third Age, leading to the Gondorian troops using wooden longbows rather than the mighty steel bows of their ancestors. To my knowledge, such a weapon never existed historically, although the closest analogue would be our modern sporting bows, which are made of metal and polymers. Skipping the officer, who's identical to the swordmaster officer, we come to the unit role, that being your ranged forces in late game and elite armies. This unit being the clear advancement of the Numenorean city guard that I spoke about before. Stats wise, this unit is great, having massive range superiority over almost every unit in the mod, meaning it can break enemy archers before they can engage it. While expensive to amass, when used in large numbers, practically nothing can stand against them, even being fairly good in melee, although they're best kept out of close combat until they've used up all their arrows. An absolutely amazing unit, grabbing as many of these dudes and using them in combination with the Numenorean Rangers is the way to go in my opinion. With the Numenorean steel bows looked at, all of the faction's archers have been studied, so it's time to look at the last category of soldier that the faction can field, cavalry. In particular, the only cavalry unit that the Empire of Numenor has access to, the Numenorean Scouts. Mounted atop unarmoured horses, these troops are essentially the Numenorean Rangers, but on horseback, wielding arming swords straight out of the 13th century for use in melee, while they have longbows on their backs for use in ranged combat. Funnily enough, while longbowmen on horseback were very much a thing in history, the truth is that mounted longbowmen didn't go into combat as horse archers, instead dismounting due to the fact that longbows are practically impossible to use while riding a horse due to their large size. In-game, these troops can shoot from horseback, which is something I don't like, and which detracts from the historical accuracy, and more importantly logic behind the unit, but it makes sense given in-game limitations and unit roles. Personally, the unit would have made way more sense if they used a short bow or recurve bow, but I understand that those aren't weapons that are associated with Numenor, unlike the longbow. Skipping their non-existent unit officer, these troops act as scouts and mounted bowmen on the battlefield, being useful at harassing enemy forces with ranged attacks, forcing them to play in accordance with how you want the battle to go. Even more so, the unit can close with the enemy and engage, being somewhat useful at cutting down enemy archers or, if required, charging into the rear of enemy formations, even if their charge abilities are quite limited compared to dedicated shock cavalry or even melee cavalry. However, while they do give you mobility on the open battlefield that the Empire of Numenor is sorely lacking, the unit does have some major drawbacks. For starters, the unit is incredibly fragile, as is to be expected of such horsemen, being doomed if caught in combat by enemy cavalry, enemy foot archers too being a great threat to them due to their natural greater range than mounted archers. Unlike the Pharazon factions who can pivot to a mounted archer army, such a strategy isn't really one that plays to the Empire of Numenor's strengths, so at best these troops are supporting units rather than the core of your army. With this unit covered, all of the factions have been looked at, so we'll move on to the faction overall. As a faction, the Empire of Numenor is very much one that's based on using significant armies of professional infantry to overwhelm enemies, having very balanced and varied options when it comes to their infantry units, be they melee troops or archers. That said, the faction is incredibly immobile, lacking meaningful cavalry apart from the Numenorean scouts, meaning that the faction plays a lot more conservatively when it comes to making moves on the battlefield, not being capable of making rapid plays the way other factions can, giving them a methodical playstyle that is somewhat choreographed to enemies by necessity. This is evened out by the fact that the Numenoreans are arguably among the best faction to use in sieges, being great both at taking and defending fortifications, overall leading to a faction that is very much balanced and plays in a way unique to the other factions that we've looked at so far in previous videos on this mod. If you've enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. It might not seem like much, but for such a small channel, it's greatly appreciated. Rest assured, more videos on this mod will be coming in the future, as well as new videos on Total War Rise of Mordor, or as it's now known, Total War The Dawnless Days. This is your host Jakov, signing out.